So what we're seeing is that these fires with urban materials tend to have a totally different chemistry. So we think that they have more metals. So we are seeing more metals from these types of fires. We do think that they're going to have higher levels of chlorinated hydrocarbons because there's much more chlorine in the urban environment than there is in the natural environment. We also expect to see things like cyanates with more nitrogen compounds because there's more nitrogen in the urban environment than in the natural landscape.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Pittcon Podcast. In this episode, we speak to Amara Holder to discuss the chemistry of fires in the wildland urban interface. So, could you briefly introduce yourself and describe what inspired you to focus on the study of emissions from combustion systems, particularly those from wildland fires?
My name is Amara Holder. I am a mechanical engineer at the U.S. Office of Research and Development at EPA. I started looking at combustion emissions in graduate school, so I was interested in the chemistry of emissions from diesel generators and how that impacted the toxicology. So my work at EPA is kind of an extension of that, except it's much more broad and focused. So I'm interested in the chemical and physical characteristics of any emission source that emits to the atmosphere that's going to be impacting air quality. And the reason why I look at wildfires in particular is because they're one of the biggest sources of emissions to the atmosphere. So it impacts millions of people and can cause many health effects, even death. And so it's really important for us to understand what chemical in smoke are.
No, definitely. And in your role at the EPA's Office of Research and Development, what have been some of the key findings that you've noticed from your study of toxic emissions from wildland fires?
So our key findings is that fires emit trace levels of toxics of many different types. And even though these emissions may be very low for the fire, so it's not the most important emission coming off of a fire like particulate matter, because the fires are so huge and so frequent, they may be a major source of these toxics to the atmosphere. So when you're looking at an emissions inventory for a single toxic compound, it's really important to characterize it from wildfires, even if it's just a trace level emission. So that's one thing that's been very important to find. Another finding that we've had is that the fuel type really matters, as do the combustion conditions. And what we're seeing is that with fires that go into the wildland urban interface and then are burning down structures and vehicles, we think that their emissions are very different than fires that go through the natural landscape. And that difference is very important in driving the emissions of toxics. So those are two of the key main findings that we found.
That's really interesting. And for individuals who may be unaware of kind of the effects of wildland fires in comparison to pollutants that are commonly spoken about, things from industrial emissions, like how would you compare them? Is there a way to compare them?
It's really hard to do that sort of comparison. We still struggle in trying to identify the impact of the chemistry of emissions and the health effects. What we can say is that wildfires emit huge amounts of particulate matter, and particulate matter, just in general, not in any specific chemistry, is a big driver of adverse health effects. And so because fires are emitting much larger amounts of particulate matter than most industrial sources, and that's really because we've been very successful at EPA in regulating industrial source emissions. Fires are a big source of adverse human health effects because there's so much emissions going out into the atmosphere.
And how has your research contributed to understanding and managing air quality impacts near wildfires?
So my research is really looking at generating data that goes into EPA's systems. So I've looked at emissions and emission factors, and we use those sorts of information to develop these emissions inventories. And the emissions inventories help us identify which sources we need to regulate and how we can most effectively reduce pollutants in the atmosphere. So that's really where my main input is. And then I also work on different aspects of wildfire smoke. So I look at the volatility distribution, and that helps us better understand when these emissions go into the atmosphere, how they evolve over time and downwind, and that helps us understand the air quality impacts downwind from fires. So really, I'm at the beginning of a long process that happens within the agency.
That's really fascinating. And could you share more on the advancements in the methods and technologies that have been used to actually inventory wildfire smoke and toxics, and also monitoring the air quality impacts near fires? And have you noticed a large evolution of these technologies over time?
Yes, definitely. We've been looking at wildfire emissions for probably about 40 years now. So over the decades, we've studied it a lot. And during that time, there's been a big advancement in our analytical capabilities. So we used to have, we have plenty of emission factors going back decades, but where they used to be non-detects, we now have very sensitive measurements and we can quantify these very low levels. So that's a huge improvement in, especially for our toxics emissions inventory. So going from a non-detect, which is nothing, to something is a very big deal. The other thing that we've noticed is that we have many more online capabilities of measuring emissions in real time. And that gives us the opportunity to look at how the emissions evolve during the course of the fire. And that's just priceless information in trying to understand what drives these emissions and what physical processes control the emission pollutant formation. The other really large advancement is in ambient monitoring networks. Right now, we have a regulatory monitoring network that's really targeted to looking at day in and day out concentrations of pollutants emitted from urban industrial sources. And these are sources that really don't change over time. Like a power plant's always emitting, people are always driving cars, and those emissions spread out over an area and get distributed. So you might have one central monitor that's really meant to be representative of a whole area. Wildfire smoke is very different because you have a relatively small fire front that emits very high concentration of pollutants into this plume, and then the plume distributes into the atmosphere. And it might be over mountain ranges and valleys, and so we see this really large gradient of concentrations from very near the fire to far away, and then it changes rapidly in time. So in the morning, your fire may not be as active as it is in the afternoon, and so you can see these concentrations kind of go up and down over the course of the day, and depending upon the wind shifts, they can change where it's impacting. And so the ambient monitoring network's not suited to capture those sorts of variations. And since wildfires are so important in driving air quality impacts, many states have added in monitors to try and better capture these variations. But the big change has been the advent of low-cost sensors. Now people have a purple air in their backyard or some other sensor, and that information is being put out into the cloud, and you can see that. And so what EPA has done in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service is generate the Air Now Fire and Smoke Map. And this leverages all of those low-cost sensors that are reporting and puts it into an accurate measurement that can be compared with some of our regulatory measurements. And it's shown the spatial gradients of wildfire smoke. It also shows the very high time resolution data. So you can see updates every 10 minutes on that map. So it's really a game changer in understanding where wildfire smoke is and isn't.
No, definitely. And I can imagine with the availability of so much data, it can only increase both the awareness of the effects that wildfire smoke can have, but also interest as well, perhaps from industry, perhaps from other research institutes.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting. Researchers are wanting to use that data to do epidemiology studies because they have a better understanding of who's being exposed and who's not being exposed. But what's really critical for us at EPA is that now we can go out to the public and we can say specifically, here is where the smoke is, here's where we've seen it. And we can start to give better forecasting information. We can say, we've seen it over the past few afternoons be really great air quality in your area. Go out and enjoy the day. In the morning when smoke is bad, stay in, run your air cleaner. So we can give much more detailed and specific public health guidance now.
That's brilliant. That's really fascinating. And speaking of kind of different approaches and things, what are some of the low-cost approaches that you've researched for reducing smoke exposure? I know you've spoken of sensors. Is there anything else that you've used? And speaking of these different technologies, how effective have they been in practical scenarios?
Sure. We've definitely looked at ways to mitigate exposure to smoke because we can't regulate ourselves out of wildfires. So it's really important that we have tools to reduce exposure. When there's a wildfire smoke event, air cleaners, which are very effective at reducing smoke concentrations, rapidly sell out. They can often be very expensive, so it's hard for some people to afford an air cleaner. And what we've seen people use is what's known as a do-it-yourself air cleaner. So this is a box fan with a furnace filter attached. And these are extremely effective at reducing smoke concentrations. And we found that the more filters that you put on these box fans, the more effective they can be. And so there is a design with 4 filters or even 5 filters in a box shape on that fan. And those are called Corsi-Rosenthal boxes. And those will be as effective as a $600 commercial air cleaner at reducing smoke concentrations in the home.
Oh, wow.
And they don't require any special equipment, really. It's a box fan that you can pick up at a hardware store and furnace filters that you can pick up as well. So they're much more accessible than other types of air cleaners.
Have you found that the information of how to make this air filter, has that been like very community driven, or is it just kind of one person with a YouTube video kind of put it online?
It's definitely been community driven. There are multiple videos online, and they certainly expanded with the pandemic because people were using these types of box fans, air cleaners, to reduce COVID risk.
Right, okay.
But there are local air quality agencies in areas that are inundated by smoke that actively go out there and show people how to build these. They'll provide the materials to help people build them.
That's really good.
Really trying to get more clean air out there in their communities.
Oh, wow. And so in your presentation, speaking of Pittcon, you mentioned the challenges in measuring certain chemical compounds emitted from WI fires. Could you talk a little bit about these challenges and how we might actually address them?
Sure. So one of the major challenges from these types of fires is that they're completely unpredictable and they happen very rapidly. So it's hard to know when it's going to happen or where it's going to happen. And when it does happen, it usually happens in a matter of hours. So the fire is ignited, it rapidly moves through a community, and a community is destroyed before you even have a chance to mobilize. So that's really difficult to get a measurement when it's gone before you've had a chance. Another issue is that some of the measurements that we really want to have of toxic compounds are requiring instruments that are a little bit more difficult to set up, that might be challenging to mobilize quickly. So trying to get the measurements we want in the place that we want is really difficult. So some of the ways that we can address this is by doing some aircraft-based research. So that's what's normally done for wildfire smoke, is that you set up an aircraft campaign, you have all of your fancy instrumentation on the aircraft, and you fly out to where you need to go. But the risk with that is that you could sit for months waiting for a wildland urban interface fire to occur, or longer. It may just never happen. So other ways of approaching the problem is to rely on an ambient monitoring network. And we've done that. So we've looked at historical data at some of monitors that have been hit by wildfire smoke. But some of the challenges with that approach is that these monitors that are measuring the speciated compounds that we want to see, they don't operate every day. So sometimes they're on a 1 in 3 schedule or a 1 in 6 schedule, meaning they only measure every 1 out of 6 days. So you really need to be lucky that the plume hit your ambient monitoring site and your ambient monitoring site was actually running the day that you wanted it, that it got hit. So one thing that we could do to improve our chances of capturing the smoke is to increase the frequency of these samples at these monitoring networks that are in areas that are more likely to have these types of fires, and in the seasons when the fires are more likely to occur. So that could be one way of trying to capture that information. And another way is just going into the lab and trying to simulate it. And so we're seeing many different types of studies trying to take that approach right now, is to take urban materials into a laboratory environment and try to burn them and recreate those conditions to generate those emissions, and then have very controlled conditions to study all of the chemistry. There's also drawbacks to that approach in that it's very difficult to replicate the conditions of these fires. A typical wildland urban interface fire is wind-driven, meaning you could have winds of 50 to 60 miles per hour. So it's very extreme conditions. You can have very high temperatures, high enough to melt metal. And that's hard to recreate in the lab. So that's what you're missing in the laboratory conditions. And also combustion systems are difficult to scale. It's not easy to burn an entire vehicle, and it's also not easy to scale that down into an experiment that's easy to recreate.
I can imagine it can be quite expensive as well to try and generate such high temperatures, or just even get the equipment as well to, even if you're downscaling it, there's still a lot of things need to be involved and yeah.
Right. It requires a lot of resources to try and do these experiments. And even with a lot of resources, you might have only a handful of experiments. So you end up with a limited amount of data.
And how do the emissions from wildland-urban interface fires differ chemically from those from other wildfires? And what implications does this have for environmental and public health?
So what we're seeing is that these fires with urban materials tend to have a totally different chemistry. So we think that they have more metals. So we are seeing more metals from these types of fires. We do think that they're going to have higher levels of chlorinated hydrocarbons because there's much more chlorine in the urban environment than there is in the natural environment. We also expect to see things like cyanates with more nitrogen compounds because there's more nitrogen in the urban environment than in the natural landscape. So all of these differences at the chemical level of the fuel we think are impacting the emissions from these types of fires. What we know about some of these potential emissions when you have chlorine, nitrogen, et cetera, in your initial mix is that you can have a more toxic emission. And so we don't have conclusive evidence that these emissions are more toxic, but we do strongly suspect that they are. And what we've seen from the urban fire setting, where you have firefighters that go out to a structure fire and put it out, those firefighters do have health risks involved, and we have seen that they have health effects if they don't wear proper protective equipment and do proper procedures to clean their gear and protect themselves. So when you're looking at a wildland urban interface fire, you're kind of magnifying that on a much larger scale, and it's not only impacting the first responders, but the public health as well.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And kind of building on that, what are some of the unanswered questions for future research directions? And is there anything that you're particularly excited about in the field of wildfire emissions and air quality?
Well, the exciting thing is that there's so many unanswered questions. So it's a great area to do research. I just feel like there's a lot of opportunity for so many people to come in there and do some amazing experiments. So I'm really excited to see what people come up with. I know that there are laboratory studies going on right now, and I'm excited to see the data that come out of that. I think that's really going to be very informative for us at EPA in driving our inventories and also helping us shape how we tell people to protect themselves from this type of smoke. And I think for me personally, that's the most important thing, is to understand what is the proper public health guidance. How do I tell people to protect themselves? Do they run an air cleaner? Do they need something more? Or do they just need to evacuate? We need to know the emissions information in order to answer that question. So I'm really excited to see what researchers are going to develop over these next few years.
That's interesting. And one question I have as well is, you mentioned earlier about going out visiting a different country for field research. Have you noticed attitudes being different globally to the health aspects of kind of the wildland and urban wildlife fires? Like, how have you kind of noticed people's like knowledge and like attitudes towards kind of approaching them and like you say, like cleaning their equipment? Does it change across the world?
I think it does. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of experience at the global level. I do read the literature, certainly from other areas that are impacted by these fires, like Australia and Portugal and Spain and Greece. And I like to see what sort of information they look at. I do see some more focus on some of the other areas of wildfires that we haven't looked at as closely in the United States, like looking at ash fall and better understanding what the ash is. We're starting to work on that research right now in the States. There's also different management approaches between these different countries. And so I find that interesting to see how these hazard reduction fires that they use in Australia are a lot more common, and now we're starting to use prescribed burning as well in areas in like California where there's high risk for these wildland urban interface fires. But as far as like the response from the health effects and from the toxic emissions, I haven't really seen many differences. And in my own experience within the United States, I find it interesting listening to people and what they talk about with fires. I do hear a lot of people say, wow, it's okay. It's just wildfire smoke from forest fires, and that's natural, and it's not harmful like that urban fires or from a house. So there is some understanding that there is a difference between those two types of fires, but there's not a clear understanding that wildfire smoke of any kind is harmful to people's health. And it's important to try and reduce exposure if you can.
Pittcon Perspectives, unforgettable Pittcon moments from the experts.
So, as you know, we're currently marking the 75th anniversary of Pittcon. Could you share your first memory or experience of attending this conference and how it's impacted your view of the scientific community, both of your own community and just in general?
Well, this is my first time attending Pittcon.
Okay, any good memories so far?
So far, I'm really taking it all in. It's very interesting. It's very different being at a conference for chemists by chemists. So I do love to hear people really go into the weeds about how their, triple quad MS.
Yeah, very
works.
niche.
Yes. It is astounding to see the experts doing what they do best. And so I really am appreciative of these people and the work that they do and how it really benefits my own work. So it's been fun.
Oh, that's lovely. And what are you most looking forward to at Pittcon 2024 in San Diego across this week?
Well, I'm most looking forward to is the exposition. So I always love to get out onto the floor and see what's new. That's probably my favorite thing of any conference is to see what new tech's out there and what sort of gadgets
new, what's shiny
I can get my hands on. I love taking new measurements and having new tools to take these measurements. And so that's the best part is to get out there, talk to people. And then one thing I always love to do is tell people about my problems. I tell them about my measurement problems and often they have a solution for me. And if they don't, they might have one next year. And so that's one area that I take full advantage of.
That's really interesting, and I imagine it's mutually beneficial as well to the people that you talk to, because if they're designing instrumentation, they should be designing it with you in mind. So knowing what challenges that you're currently experiencing can be insightful for them as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to build those relationships because the instrument vendors are really what we live on because we need those instruments to take our measurements.